There is a saying that used to pass between the old women of the hill country the way a good knife passes between hands. Water finds its level, and cold finds its crack. You could hear it spoken over quilting frames on January afternoons, or murmured beside a sick animal in a dim barn, or pressed like a dry flower into the pages of a letter nobody was expected to answer. It was not a dramatic saying. It did not ask for attention. It simply described the way the world worked for people who had lived long enough to watch it work. Harriet Bryn heard it first when she was 9 years old, sitting on a split-log bench beside her grandmother in the corner of a stone smokehouse, while wind raked the ridge outside and rattled the door on its leather hinges. Her grandmother, a woman named Opal, who had come to the Missouri Hill Country as a young bride in 1901 and had never once left it, pressed the girl's hand and repeated the sentence slowly, as though she were setting fence posts in frozen ground. Water finds its level, and cold finds its crack. Then Opal went back to turning the meat on its hook and said nothing more about it, and Harriet carried the sentence into adulthood the way you carry a stone in your coat pocket, not knowing exactly why you keep it, certain only that it has weight. Harriet was born in 1941 on a mixed-tenure farm on a ridge above the Gasconade River Valley in central Missouri. The ridge ran roughly east to west for about 4 miles, a limestone spine that shed water fast and held topsoil reluctantly. On the north face, it dropped sharply into a hollow, thick with sycamore and cottonwood. On the south face, it gentled down through cedar glades and thin grass pasture toward the bottomland that flooded 3 years out of 5. Her parents worked the ridge farm through the 40s and 50s. Her father died in 1962, her mother in 1969, and Harriet, who had married a quiet man named Gordon Bryn, who fixed machinery for a living and asked almost nothing of anyone, inherited the farm outright at 28 years old. She was, by 1969, one of precisely 2 women in the county who held a deed to agricultural land in their own name. The other was 81 and had not walked her ground in a decade. Harriet walked hers every morning, in every season, for the next 24 years, wearing the same pair of rubber-soled leather boots until they were resolved to almost nothing, and then buying an identical pair and wearing those. Gordon died of a cardiac event in March of 1971, leaving Harriet with a daughter of 4 named Louise and a son of 7 named Cale, a functioning tractor that was paid for, and 412 acres of ridge and slope that needed constant attention and offered modest return. She did not sell. She did not lease the cultivated ground to the row crop operation that came to her door twice in the spring of 1972 with a polite letter and then a less polite letter. She said no each time in the same flat voice she used to describe the weather, and she went back to what she was doing, which was reading. Specifically, she was reading a ledger. The ledger had been her grandmother Opal's. It was a cloth-bound book, dark green, the cover soft as old skin, and inside it, in a handwriting that was precise and unhurried, Opal had kept 43 years of weather observations on the ridge. Not casual notes, systematic ones. First and last frost dates, recorded to the day. Wind direction in each month, noted in a 4-point shorthand Opal had invented. Ice events, which Opal distinguished carefully from snow events, giving each a severity number from 1 to 4 based on damage to trees and fences. Opal had also kept notes on what survived and what did not, which fence lines held in heavy winters, which did not, which windbreaks deflected the northeast wind that Opal called the killing wind, the one that came off the open country to the north in late January, and drove cold through any gap in the landscape like a hand pushed through wet paper, and which windbreaks, built in ignorance of the ridge's particular geometry, accomplished nothing at all except to satisfy the eye of the person who planted them. Harriet read the ledger through in the spring of 1972, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her hand. Then she read it again. Then she sat with it for 3 days without opening it, doing her regular work, and then she went back and read certain pages a 3rd time. She was looking for something specific. She found it in an entry dated January 1929, written in Opal's even hand. Opal had noted an ice storm of severity 4, the worst in her recorded 43 years, and she had written a single additional sentence beneath the data. She had written, "The wind came from the north-northeast and entered the ridge at the gap above the second pasture, and everything south and west of that gap was taken." Harriet folded a piece of paper into that page and closed the ledger. She went to her barn, got a roll of surveyor's flagging tape, and walked the ridge to the gap above the second pasture. She stood in it. She felt the geometry of it, the way the terrain funneled air from the north-northeast the way a cupped hand funnels water. Then she walked the line south and west from that gap, 200 yards of it, and she flagged the ground every 20 feet. When she came back in, she wrote a number on a piece of paper and pinned it to the wall above the kitchen table. The number was 216. That was how many Osage orange trees she calculated she would need to plant along that line to close the gap and establish a working hedge that would redirect the killing wind up and over the ridge rather than into it. She planned the hedge in 3 staggered rows, the outer rows tight planted at 8 feet apart, the middle row offset by 4 feet. She planned it at a minimum effective height of 12 feet before she would consider it functional, and she calculated, based on Opal's notes on established hedge growth on the ridge, that it would take 11 years to reach that height in the thin limestone soil. In March of 1982, she started planting. She bought her rootstock from a nursery 2 counties south that was faintly puzzled by the order, since Osage orange, also called hedge apple, had fallen out of agricultural fashion in Missouri by the late 60s, replaced by steel T-posts and barbed wire, which were cheaper to install and required no maintenance and had no opinion about anything. The nurseryman, whose name was Delbert Crane, told Harriet with genuine friendliness that he thought she might be making the job harder than it needed to be. She could put in a good windbreak of eastern red cedar in a quarter of the time, he said, and cedar was practically free. Harriet said she knew about cedar. She paid for the Osage orange rootstock, loaded it into the bed of her truck herself, and drove home. She planted through April and May of 1982 with Louise, who was now 15, and Cale, who was 18 and heading for a community college in the fall, and who thought his mother's project was somewhere between eccentric and a little heartbreaking, as though she were filling the silence left by his father with something that had no name yet. He helped her anyway. They planted 219 trees over 7 weeks, working early in the morning before the day heat came, carrying water in 5-gallon cans up the ridge by hand because the ground was too steep and broken for the tractor. The Osage orange went into the ground as bare whips 2 to 3 feet tall, gray and unpromising as fence posts. When they were finished, Harriet stood at the south end of the line and looked north along it, 200 yards of small gray sticks trembling in a light wind, and she did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, 11 years. She meant it as a fact, not a complaint. The county agricultural extension agent that summer was a man named Warren Polk, 34 years old, recently arrived from the university program, full of earnest conviction and color-printed pamphlets. He drove out to the Bryn farm in June to discuss the federal cost-share program for approved conservation practices, found Harriet on the ridge pulling grass from around the newly planted whips, and stood at the edge of the planted line for a while before saying what he had clearly been trying not to say since he arrived. He asked her if she knew that Osage orange was considered, at this point in modern conservation science, a somewhat outdated choice. She said she had heard that. He said the newer shelter belt designs used a mix of conifers and shrubs that had better documented performance data. She said she imagined they did. He asked, very gently, if she had considered that the 11 to 15-year establishment period might represent a significant opportunity cost. She said she had. He told her there was no cost share available for unapproved species plantings. She said she knew. He drove away and filed a report that described the Bryn Ridge farm as hosting a non-standard conservation planting by the landowner, progress and outcomes uncertain, owner non-responsive to agency guidance. He was a conscientious man, and he felt he had been kind, which was true, and he was wrong about the hedge, which was also true, and neither of those facts had anything to do with the other. Through the summer and fall of 1982 and into the winter, and then the spring of 1983, the whips grew. They grew slowly. In their first year, they added perhaps 18 inches of height on average, and some added less. They were thorny from the beginning, which was part of their nature, the thorns arranged along every stem with a kind of patient hostility that made the plants seem more purposeful than ornamental. Harriet tended them through drought and through a wet spring that rotted 6 of the 219, which she replaced. She pulled grass and thistle from around their bases by hand, refusing to spray herbicide close to the stems. She carried water in dry spells. She did not miss a week of maintenance from 1982 through 1987. By 1984, the hedge was waist-high on a tall person and beginning to thicken from within. Harriet could see the structure of it developing, the stems starting to lean into one another and interlock, the outer rows beginning to throw a shadow. She began, in the summer of 1984, to lay the hedge, a technique Opal had described in the ledger, and that almost no one under the age of 60 in the county knew how to do. Laying a hedge meant selecting the strongest upright stems and making a long diagonal cut at the base, nearly through the stem but not quite, and then bending the stem over horizontally and weaving it through its neighbors so that it continued to live and thicken while becoming part of the horizontal matrix of the hedge. Done correctly, laying created a structure that was impenetrable to livestock and enormously strong against wind load, because the weaving distributed force across the whole body of the hedge rather than concentrating it at individual stems. Done incorrectly, it killed the stems. Harriet had watched Opal lay a section of old hedge when she was 12 years old and had never seen it done since, and she worked slowly at first, making small cuts and checking them, until her hands remembered what her eyes had seen 30 years earlier. The neighbors who walked or drove the ridge road past the Bryn farm and saw Harriet bent over the hedge with a billhook in her hand had a range of opinions. A woman named Dottie Hale, who lived at the bottom of the hollow and occasionally brought surplus garden produce up the hill and left it on Harriet's porch as an act of soft, persistent charity, asked one afternoon whether all that work on those old thorny trees was some kind of grief project, and whether Harriet might not find it easier to come into town for the ladies' Thursday gathering at the church basement. Harriet thanked her for the produce and said she was all right. A man named Russ Coulter, who ran 300 head of beef cattle on the adjoining farm to the east, stopped his truck on the Ridge Road and told Harriet plainly that Osage Hedge was a 19th century solution to a problem the 20th century had already solved with cheap wire, and that she was going to spend the best years of what was left of her farming life tending a fence that would give her more trouble than it gave anything else. He was not unkind when he said it. He was the kind of man who believed that being direct was the same thing as being helpful, and he had never been given a reason to reconsider that belief. Harriet told him she'd been reading about it and thought it might work out. He shook his head with the particular slow patience of a man who has explained something twice and expects to explain it a third time in a few years, and drove away. In 1986, a young woman named Darla Foss moved into the small rented house on the east corner of the Bryn farm where Harriet's parents had once housed a hired man. Darla had come from Kansas City for reasons she didn't fully explain and didn't need to, and she found work wherever she could find it, which in that part of Missouri in 1986 was not abundantly. She walked the ridge the first week she was there, the way a person orients themselves in new country, and she stopped when she came to the hedge. It was 4 years old then, roughly shoulder height on the tallest stems, the interior thick enough that you could not see fully through it. Darla walked the length of it slowly, looking at the structure, seeing the woven laid stems threaded through the uprights, seeing the way the rows were offset so that the gaps in one row were covered by stems in the next. She came to find Harriet where she was working in the barn and said, "Who showed you how to do that?" Harriet said her grandmother mostly. Darla said, "It's a system." Harriet said yes. Darla said, "Can I help?" Harriet said yes, and that was the whole of the conversation, and Darla Foss worked on the Bryn farm in one capacity or another for the rest of the decade and into the next. The years from 1986 through 1992 passed the way most years pass on a working farm, in the rhythm of seasons and problems and small adjustments. The hedge grew. By 1988, it was above head height on its tallest stems, and the laid sections had thickened to the diameter of a man's wrist, and the whole structure in winter, bare of leaves, looked like a piece of densely woven basketry 200 yards long and 15 feet wide, held together by 10,000 small interlocking decisions. In summer, it was a wall of dark, heavy leaves. In autumn, the hedge apples hung from it, green and knobbed, each one about the size of a grapefruit, and they fell in October and rolled down the slope, and no one in the county had any use for them, and Harriet did not pretend otherwise. Russ Coulter stopped on the Ridge Road in the summer of 1990 and observed for the second time that the hedge was impressive. He would give her that, but that it was also, he understood, now beginning to require significant ongoing labor to maintain its structure, and he wondered if she had done the math on hours per foot of effective fence versus steel post and wire, because he thought if she had done that math, the answer would tell her something important. Harriet said she'd done the math. He said, and she said, it works out. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he hoped she knew she could always call on him if things got difficult, which was as close as a man like Russ Coulter could come to expressing concern without expressing it, and Harriet said she appreciated it, and she meant it, and she went back to work. By 1992, the hedge had reached a height of 14 feet at its tallest sections, with the lowest sections at 11 feet. The three rows had merged in places into a single dense body. The root systems were, beneath the surface, enormous and interlocking, having reached down into limestone fractured ground in the way that Osage orange roots will, finding moisture at depth that would be unavailable in drought to shallower rooted plants. Harriet walked the line in October of 1992 and ran her hands along the main laid stems of the outer row and felt the rigidity of the structure, the way the woven wood had set, like a material stronger than any of its parts taken individually. She made no notes. She simply looked at it for a long time in the pale fall light, and then she went in and took Opal's ledger from the shelf and opened it to the entry from January 1929, and she read it again, and she set the book back on the shelf. Darla, who was in the kitchen making coffee, asked her what she was looking at. Harriet said, "I think we're about ready." Darla said, "Ready for what?" Harriet said, "Whatever comes." Whatever came in January of 1993. It announced itself in the way serious weather announces itself in the Missouri Hill Country, not with drama, but with a kind of physical quiet, a suspension of the usual sounds and motions of the landscape that people who have lived there all their lives learn to read the way you learn to read a face. The birds stopped moving the way they moved before bad weather and instead fed frantically for 3 days, which Opal had noted in the ledger as one of the reliable signs. The temperature dropped in a way that was different from normal January cold, dropping evenly and without wind, which was wrong, because cold and wind usually came together on that ridge. The clouds came from the north-northeast, which was the direction Opal had named in January of 1929, and they were the color of old pewter, and they moved without hurry, which was also wrong. Harriet checked the propane tank and the woodpile. She made sure the water lines in the barn were wrapped. She put extra feed and bedding down for her animals. She brought her 2 dogs in from the outside kennel and installed them by the wood stove. She called Cale, who now lived with his wife and 2 children in a town 40 miles south, and told him she thought the next week would be difficult and that he should make sure his family was stocked. She called Louise, who was farming her own rented ground 30 miles east, and said the same. Neither of them fully understood the urgency. Both of them trusted their mother and prepared accordingly. The ice storm began on January 12, 1993, and it lasted 4 days. It came as freezing rain first, which was the part people always underestimated, because freezing rain looked like ordinary rain and announced nothing. It coated every surface with a clear, hard shell. Then the temperature dropped 6 degrees in 2 hours, and the freezing rain continued, building the ice coat to a thickness on branches and wires and fence posts that was, by the end of the second day, close to 3 inches in places. And then the north-northeast wind came. It came at sustained speeds that the weather station 18 miles away clocked at 41 miles per hour, with gusts to 56. It came exactly as Opal had written it would come, through the gap above the second pasture, or it tried to. It hit the hedge at 14 feet of height and a depth of 15 feet, and it deflected. The physics of it were not complicated. A solid or near-solid barrier at sufficient height causes wind to ride up and over in a deflection pattern that extends, at low wind angles, a distance downwind of 6 to 10 times the barrier height. 14 feet of barrier height produced, on the south and west side of the Bryn Ridge farm, a zone of significantly reduced wind speed extending up to 140 feet from the hedge. Within that zone, ice accumulated on trees and structures, as it did everywhere. But the ice-loaded branches and power lines and fence sections did not receive the sustained wind load that drove the damage everywhere else on the ridge. On Russ Coulter's farm, which ran along the east side of the ridge without a shelter belt of any kind on the north face, 1,200 feet of steel post and barbed wire fence were destroyed in the first 18 hours. Not bent. Destroyed, the posts snapped at the frost line by ice-laden wire sections that had become rigid cables and then applied full wind load to posts set in frozen ground that had no give in it. 41 of his trees, mostly mature oaks along the fence line that he had farmed around for 30 years, because they were landmarks and because something in a man resists cutting a tree that was there before he was born, came down. 3 of them came down onto outbuildings. 1 of them came down onto a tractor he had left outside because the barn was full of hay, and the tractor was not salvageable. His electric power went on the second day and stayed gone for 11 days. His pipes froze. His propane ran out on the 3rd day because he had not known to verify the tank level before the storm, and the propane truck could not reach him because the roads were impassable. The road to Harriet's farm was also impassable. But Harriet had propane for 6 weeks and a wood stove and dry wood stacked under the eaves of the barn. She had water because her pipes held in the hedged zone. She had livestock that survived because the barn, sitting in the zone of reduced wind load behind the hedge, did not suffer the structural stress that barns elsewhere on the ridge did. On the morning of the 3rd day, she walked the hedge line in the gray light after the wind had dropped slightly, and she looked at the structure still standing. The laid stems flexed but held, the outer rows taking most of the force and transmitting it through the weave, the roots locked in limestone rock that had no intention of releasing them. 10 years and 10 months of work. She put her hand flat against the main body of the hedge and held it there for a moment, and then she took it away. Russ Coulter appeared at the edge of her farm on the 4th day, walking on the ice in rubber-soled boots, moving carefully, his face reddened by cold and something else that was not cold. He had come 1.5 miles on foot across country because the road was closed. He stood at the south end of the hedge and looked at it, and then he looked at the barn behind it, and then at the house, smoke coming from the chimney, windows intact, the whole property standing with the quiet, matter-of-fact solidity of something that had simply decided not to be destroyed. He stood there for a while without speaking. Harriet came out of the barn with a bucket and saw him standing there and set the bucket down. He said, "I owe you an apology." He said it the way a person says something they have been composing for a long time, and that still doesn't feel right no matter how long you work on it. Harriet looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "Are you out of propane?" He said yes. She said, "Come in." He said he didn't want to take anything she might need. She said she had enough. He came in, and she made coffee, and she did not say anything more about the hedge or the years of advice he had given her or the math he had once asked her to do. And after a while he stopped waiting for her to say it and drank his coffee. And the silence in the kitchen was a different kind of silence than the one that had lived between them for 11 years. Over the next week, as the roads became passable in stages and people began to move through the ridge country again, Harriet opened the farm. Not for profit. She charged nothing for the propane she let neighbors draw from her tank. keeping a simple tally of gallons so that she could document the charitable donation for the county emergency record, and she charged nothing for the nights people slept on her floor or in the spare room, and she charged nothing for the meals that Darla cooked in relays from the stores in the cold room and the deep pantry. What she did charge was attention. She asked any farmer who came through and who was willing to listen to walk the hedge line with her, and she explained, in the flattest and most factual language she could find, what Opal had written in 1929 and what that had told her to do, and how long it had taken, and what it had cost in labor hours, and what it had held against. She showed them the ledger. She showed them the laid stems and explained the technique. She showed them where to make the cut and how to judge the angle, and how to weave the laid stem through its neighbors so that the whole was stronger than the parts. 7 farmers walked that line with her in the 2 weeks after the storm, 5 men and 2 women, and 4 of them planted Osage orange hedges on their own ground within 2 years of that conversation. The other 3 planted other species in windbreak configurations that addressed the specific geometry of their particular ridges, which was also the right answer, and which they would not have understood to do without the conversation. Warren Polk, the extension agent, who was by 1993 45 years old and somewhat different in his convictions than he had been at 34, drove out to the Bryn farm in February and walked the hedge line alone before he knocked on the door. He stood in the same spot Russ Coulter had stood in and looked at the same evidence. When Harriet answered the door, he did not apologize immediately, the way Coulter had, because he was constitutionally unable to apologize quickly about professional matters. He asked instead if she would be willing to speak at the county conservation meeting in March and whether she would bring the ledger. She said she would. He said he thought what she had done deserved to be in the literature, by which he meant the extension service literature, the pamphlets and the bulletins that went out to farmers across the region. She said she thought what Opal had done deserved to be in the literature. He said yes, that was what he meant. It was not entirely what he had meant, but it was close enough, and Harriet accepted it as close enough. She spoke at the conservation meeting in March of 1993, with Opal's ledger open on the table in front of her and Darla sitting 2 seats to her left. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes, which was the longest continuous speech anyone who knew her had ever heard her make. She talked about the geometry of the ridge, about the gap above the second pasture, about the specific physics of wind deflection, and the specific biological characteristics of Osage orange that made it suited to the task. She talked about the technique of laying a hedge and offered to demonstrate it in the field for any farmer who wanted to see it done. She talked about keeping records, not vague impressions but systematic records, dated, numbered, cross-referenced, the way Opal had kept them, because the land changed slowly, and no single lifetime was long enough to see all of its patterns, unless someone had been paying attention before you and written it down. She quoted exactly the entry from January 1929, and she read it in Opal's voice as best she could remember it, which is to say she read it plainly, without embellishment, the way you read a fact you trust. When she was finished, she sat down and there was a long moment of silence in the meeting room, and then the chairman thanked her and opened the floor, and 17 people had questions, which was 17 more than usually had questions at a conservation meeting in that county. The years after 1993 extended in the direction that years extend, when a piece of knowledge has found its proper home in a place. Darla Foss, who had come to the Ridge Farm in 1986 for reasons she hadn't fully explained, stayed permanently and eventually held a partial interest in the property and kept bees in the lee of the hedge where the wind reduction created a microclimate warm enough to extend the effective foraging season by nearly 3 weeks in spring. Louise, Harriet's daughter, brought her own family back to the Ridge Country in 1997 and began keeping the kind of systematic weather record that Opal had kept, carrying it forward, adding a 3rd generation of dated observations to the record. Cale, who had gone his own direction in life, came back twice a year and walked the hedge line with his children when they were old enough to walk it, and told them what it had taken and what it had held against, and why. The hedge itself continued to grow and thicken and root itself more deeply into the limestone rock of the ridge. By 2005, it was 16 feet in height at its tallest sections, and the root mass beneath it had become a feature of the soil, a long underground architecture of interlocked systems that held the ridge edge against the erosion that had taken the topsoil from unprotected slopes all along the valley. Ecologists from the university came to study it twice, once in 1998 and again in 2007. And both times they wrote papers that cited the hedge as an example of pre-industrial agroecological wisdom whose abandonment in the mid-20th century had cost the region more than anyone had accurately calculated. They did not cite opal by name in the first paper. In the second one, they did. Harriet Bryn died in the winter of 2014 at the age of 72, in the house she had been born in, with Louise in the next room and Darla at the kitchen table, and both of her dogs arranged on the floor beside the wood stove in the way that dogs arrange themselves when they understand something without being told. She had kept her own section of the ledger running from 1972 to 2013, 41 years of ridge weather recorded in the same precise shorthand Opal had used, and she had added one feature Opal had not included, which was a column for what she called hedge condition, rated on the same 1 to 4 scale Opal had used for storm severity, checked and dated every January. The final entry in her section of the ledger, dated December of 2013, read, Condition 4, holding. The following spring, Louise mounted a piece of weathered oak board at the south end of the hedge line where the planted row began, and she burned into it a sentence that she had heard her mother say exactly once in the kitchen of the farmhouse on a winter morning in 1993, when the coffee was done and Russ Coulter had gone home and the ice was beginning to melt from the ridge in the pale January sun, and Harriet had stood at the window looking at the hedge against the white sky and said it quietly, to no one in particular, or perhaps to Opal, or perhaps to the ridge itself. Cold finds its crack, and a hedge finds it first. That was what Louise burned into the oak. That was what was there on the board at the south end of the line, and what is there still, the letters deepened now by 15 years of weather, the wood silver gray, the thorny old trees leaning over it from above in every season, indifferent to whether anyone reads it, holding the ridge the way they have always held it, patient and interlocked and entirely certain of their work.